All right, good. Welcome. I got to start saying it every time. Welcome to Halitics. Welcome to the Hal Ginsberg Show. I'm Hal Ginsberg. Of course, it's Monday the 20th, and I'm getting a little bit of a late start. Sorry about that. And I said I've got to make sure, and this is part of the issue, I guess, is just being totally prepped as I start the program. So I'm ready at exactly 11 a.m. And a lot of folks, it doesn't really matter if you're doing a podcast. So what if you're 10 minutes late? Nobody cares. And even if you're doing live streams for a lot of folks, if it's not appointment radio, if you want to call it that, obviously this is video, it's not radio, but if it's not appointment, it doesn't matter so much. The problem for me is I want you to call in. So I really should be starting at exactly 11 pretty much every weekday. And I promise to get better at that. I do apologize for the issues this morning. I'm showing you why a little bit on the screen. You can see it there. I had my shingles vaccine on Saturday, I guess it was. And I highlighted my side effects. Man, it's just hasn't been great. I've got to tell you what, getting that, oh man, and it was bad. Sore arm for sure, moderate pain. And then yesterday, that was at the time, right? That was when I had it. But then as of yesterday, it got really bad where I had real fatigue, muscle pain, a headache. Not so much the headache. That's probably a little bit of a overstatement or whatever word you want to use. I don't really think I had a headache, but definitely the shivering and man, just the fatigue. And I'm still feeling it. So if anyone else has had that issue where they've had a shingles vaccine and you want to share with me, go ahead. Would like to hear from you. You can see the phone number. I put it right on the screen there. It is 240-363-7190. And also struggling a little bit here with my tech. I don't know why that is. Oh, there we go. That'll look a lot better now that I got that. I think I'll have it better for you. Sometimes I don't know whether it's because I use open source, but there probably are some little bugs or glitches you wouldn't get with paid software programs. But hey, this is not a for-profit enterprise. I do want to hopefully get a little bit of recoups expenses, but I'm not doing this to make money. I'm doing this because I have a passion for presenting the world to you as I see it, and hopefully with some solutions for the terrific, tremendous problems that we face. And they're just, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think in a lot of ways we're facing the worst challenges as a species we've ever faced. And some people will say, well, we don't have a Hitler, we don't have worldwide slavery the way we did a few hundred years ago. So things are better. They're on an upswing. I'm not buying it. I mean, I am definitely saying, thank God, we don't have genocide to the same degree that we had 70, 80 years ago. We don't have a worldwide system based on enslaving people. But in terms of worldwide ecological collapse, I don't know that we've ever faced. I don't think anything like the climate cataclysm has struck us. And there was an interesting letter in Carolyn Hacks. I sometimes read her advice from a granddad or wishing he was a granddad, really irritated because his daughter-in-law has said, we don't want kids because of the climate crisis. And he feels betrayed. He should have. How could people make such bad decisions? Well, if you've listened to me in the past, you know that that's where I am. I don't see the future right now. And if you didn't have children because you were in a concentration camp or death camp, obviously you probably couldn't have them anyway. But it made sense, right? I mean, if you saw the Nazis knocking on your door, then obviously you're not going to want to bring children into a world where they're likely to be murdered. And obviously the same situation transpires if you're a slave. Birth rates were low for slaves, and the slave owners, the enslavers would rape women for their own pleasure, but also to create more slaves. because people enslaved aren't probably really inclined to bring a lot of children into a horrible, horrible situation. So, that's where we are now. We're seeing birth rates declining, and in one way, it makes even more sense not to have kids today, because in the past, if you were in a concentration camp or you saw your futures likely to have children who could well be murdered by genocidal maniacs, then having children would mean their lives would be short and miserable. But it wouldn't mean you were exacerbating the problem. You weren't making things even worse. Things were terrible. They very likely would get worse, but the very act of procreating wouldn't exacerbate or aggravate the problem. But today, if you have children, especially if you're affluent, you're from a first world, you're doing two things. You're bringing children into a bad situation that is almost certainly going to get worse. And let me just, you don't need to see this shingles thing. One more time. Yeah. Very sore arm. It's still sore. Mild to moderate pain. Definitely moderate. I wouldn't say mild. I wouldn't say it was acute, but it definitely didn't feel good. I don't know about the redness and swelling because I got a band-aid there, never looked. And I'll definitely had fatigue, muscle pain, and shivering. So some cold, right? Some feeling cold as well. So not great. Did watch basketball, but wasn't even so into it. All right, let's get to our first story. For I think everything we're struggling with as a nation, um, and that's hyper partisanship, militarism, um, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, and global poverty, the climate cataclysm, which I've discussed. I mean, these all are part and parcel of the same globe, dynamic we're witnessing in uh, Ukraine right now. So this is from Politico. This was last week, and there's real fear in the neocon universe that if Trump is either elected or even nominated, he could sabotage the war. Now, I want to be real clear. I have to make this. I really shouldn't have to make this caveat or whatever word you want. I'm not a Trump supporter. I don't endorse Trump. Trump is horrible, right? I mean, I will not vote for Trump. There's no way. I don't care who Trump runs against. I'm not voting for. But we have to reckon with the reality on the ground. We have to reckon with the no permanent allies, no permanent friends rule. And this article by Politico provides you with a very powerful reason for believing that, and let me say it this way, that Trump isn't on every issue wrong the way the corporate media, the Democratic Party establishment wants you to believe. They have done a masterful job, with Trump's help, demonizing Trump, getting you to believe that if Trump thinks something, it's wrong. If Trump's on one side, you should be on the other. And this has great benefits for the military industrial class and for the neoliberal class as well. It has great advantages because many of the positions that Trump has taken over the years are directly counter to their interests. So his relatively early opposition to the war on Iraq, as contrasted to Hillary Clinton, for example, his attempts, his efforts to wage some kind of peace with Russia, those his withdrawal, right? He negotiated a peace deal with Afghanistan. Those are all profoundly threatening to the permanent war class, the permanent war, the endless war mongers who have had so much influence and so much power over our government since at least the 1960s, at least the pro-Vietnam War hawks like Scoop Jackson, the Henry Kissingers, and on and on and on. Wherever you look, the Caspar Weinbergers, it just didn't end. So we now see it, the Victoria Newlands. I hope these names are at least somewhat familiar to you. I assume they are. So Trump's efforts, maybe not real effective in some cases, were very threatening to the Cheneys, right? The Bushes. Who hates Trump? Liz Cheney, who just betrayed the party that she has been so loyal to for so long, or betrayed the leader of that party, Liz Cheney. Is it because she really cares about democracy? I don't know what in her record would ever suggest that. The pro-torture congresswoman from Wyoming, I don't think she cares much about our freedoms. But she sure as heck cares about a massive spigot of money going to the Pentagon and endless war. I mean, right? Her father is the king of Halliburton. Of course they're going to go after Trump. So we're seeing the Trump enemies, many of whom are our enemies, coming out of the woodwork. Here's the former NATO chief. He's very afraid of Trump sabotaging the war on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. He's really afraid that this war to the last Ukrainian could at least see less financial support from the U.S. taxpayer. And I guess that's profoundly threatening. So this guy But hey, maybe if he's just the Republican nominee, we could see a reduction or an end to our promotion of endless war in Ukraine. So Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former Secretary General of NATO, is very concerned that if Trump wins the Republican nomination, he could shatter the bipartisan front in favor of Ukraine. I don't know, is it so bipartisan? DeSantis has kind of said that our interests aren't there either. It is true that every Democrat supports this disastrous intervention, this disastrous proxy war. He's really afraid maybe Congress won't support this war. We won't be spending billions every single day of your money to prolong an endless war. He's very afraid we could see a weakening of support for Ukraine, says Rasmussen. So how should we take that? Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Well, former Prime Minister of Denmark in the first decade of the let's say it this way, the third millennium. You know, we can say the 21st century. Let's go to the third millennium. First decade of the third millennium, Anders Fogh Rasmussen was a pretty hard right prime minister, a aggressive guy, a guy who got the support, by the way, of the far right. I'm going to say Rasmussen is hard right. He was supported. It's important to bear this in mind. He was supported by the hard right in Denmark. And when he was at a NATO meeting, all the big, they're not generals. These aren't actually people who fight. I guess the military, I don't know what better word than the military industrial complex. They're all together. They're having good food and drinks in Brussels, where there's lots of good French food. And what is Wagner? They're all enjoying themselves, and suddenly he speaks, this guy Rasmussen, the one who is so afraid of Trump. If you're afraid of Trump, welcome Anders Fogh Rasmussen to your team. Rasmussen starts speaking. He is so angry at Syria and Iran that participants thought they heard the war drums. That's who is the guy. Now, was this people when it comes to the military and the whole world? We cannot, says Rasmussen, at NATO, which is Great Britain, UK, well, the same thing, UK, Germany, US, France, the most powerful military in the world. We can't stick our head regarding Syria. And also the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this got me really confused. Now, I understand they're really worried about that oil, right? God, it was 2012. We didn't all know about how bad. Oh, yeah, we did. The climate crisis was. We got to make sure we're securing that oil. I don't really get, this is something I'm totally confused by, honestly. Maybe you can help me with this. How is the Strait of Hormuz, which is between the Horn of Arabia, I guess that's like the Emirates, right? Qatar, Abu Dhabi, and Bahrain. There's an island, the island Bahrain, and Iran are on the opposite sides of the Strait of Hormuz. Syria ain't nowhere near the Strait of Hormuz. Syria isn't even on the Red Sea. Syria's got nothing to do with this. So I don't really get why Syria is relevant, except I guess maybe Rasmussen thought all Muslim countries were the same. I'm not really clear. He was Islamophobe as well. Did not, supported a number of very strong anti-Muslim laws in Denmark in that first decade of the third millennium. So Rasmussen was pushing the drums of war against Syria and against Iran all the way back, totally unrelated, by the way, although I guess they were allies, right? They're allies, I think. Going back to 2012. And who supported him? So maybe if we look at who his supporters were, we'd say, well, maybe Rasmussen isn't so bad. Because my point here is that if Rasmussen doesn't like Trump, If Rasmussen is afraid of Trump, then maybe Trump is really that bad, right? Maybe we should say, yeah, if Rasmussen, I mean, we got to agree with Rasmussen, right? Or not. What's his track record? It's terrible. His track record. So, as I said, Rasmussen pushed through anti-Muslim laws 20 years ago in Denmark as head of NATO. He beat the war drums against Syria, which has been a terrible, terrible, deadly war that we have been fighting as a proxy against Russia, the former Soviet Union, for 10, 12 years now. And who support him? Turkey, Erdogan, a totalitarian tyrant, and Hillary Clinton, who was wrong on everything. Hillary Clinton totally agreed with Rasmussen. Yes, we got to fight. We've got to fight in Syria. We've got to fight against Iran. We've got to stand up to these people. It's all a proxy war against Russia. So the track record of Rasmussen is awful. The people who support Rasmussen is awful. Now, why was Hillary Clinton so on the side of Rasmussen, NATO? Well, we want NATO support for our proxy war in Syria, no-fly zone over Syria, direct, maybe a hot war with Russia 10 years ago, 11 years ago. So, of course, and as NATO supported, and by the way, Rasmussen supported that Libya war where we toppled Gaddafi, claiming he was going to go door to door, kill everyone in East Libya, and turned Libya into a terrorist training zone, into a slave trading zone. That's what we did to Libya with the support of Rasmussen. So the guy who's now telling us we can't even have Trump be the Republican nominee, we can't do it because, my God, he might stop war. He might end our. Of course, they're not going to, say, well, maybe Trump's got a point here. So he, back in February, a month ago or so, I missed this. So this is from The Independent in London, UK, which I found out recently. I don't know how recently. When I was in England, let me digress. So I was back in England, back in London. I studied the pubs. I studied the train schedules to go to Dublin and the continent. Studied some pretty humorous plays on the in London, and had a good time all around. When I was there, I mostly read. I have to admit, I'm somewhat not embarrassed, but I guess my parochialism. I did read mostly the International Herald Tribune, which was at that time a melange, a pastiche of the Washington Post and the New York Times. But now it's just the New York Times. The New York Times kicked the Washington Post out. But, I like reading the International Herald Tribune a lot. I tried to force myself to read The Guardian. The Guardian was a little more intellectual, I think a little denser, very pro-labor, very anti-Thatcher. It was the only one, really, that was anti-Thatcher. I think the Independent was a separately owned paper at that time. This is 1984. Since then, the Guardian took over the Independent, and the Guardian has moved definitely to the center. It's much more of a neoliberal. Oregon, it's very similar in a lot of ways to the New York Times and the Washington Post. Disappointment, to say the least. But back then, it really was pretty independent, and I guess so was the Independent. I'm not really sure. But here, the Guardian owned Independent reports Trump mocked after revealing his plan to end Ukraine war. Knock heads and get it done. So is Trump, I mean, maybe he's just naive, he's stupid, whatever else we say about Trump. I think his, instincts are right. We need peace. We need to end the war. But if his plan is that stupid as that he's being mocked for it, we should throw him overboard anyway. So is it that bad a plan? What is his plan exactly? Let's find out. Trump has to say in the Independent. The saddest part about this war is that it never should have happened, but it did. Could have, and Trump's right. It shouldn't have. Why wasn't there aggressive efforts to stop it? And there weren't. And in fact, even after it started, we know that the U.S. said to Zelensky, no negotiations. No, we'll give you lots of weaponry, but no negotiations until he gets out of Donbass, until they get out of Crimea. No more peace talks. So not having, you have to get people in a room, you have to knock heads, and you have to get it done. So that's what he's being mocked for. What are you, crazy? Come on, Trump. You can't have peace that way. Putin's a madman. He's a maniac. It's like Munich all over again. You're crazy if you think that. All right. So is that fair? Is that a fair critique of Trump's plan? Well, first of all, Munich wasn't about putting people in a room and telling them you got to get it done. Because Trump is saying you got to say things to Putin and to Zelensky that they don't want to hear. And do we have you couldn't do that to nobody did that to Hitler. Hitler was insane, first of all, and second of all, at Munich he was given what he wanted. You can have Czechoslovakia, go ahead, take it. That's not at all what Trump is saying here. He's not saying give in. He's saying you tell him you got to get the hell out. You got to stop the militarism. You got to demilitarize the border, the frontier there. You got to absolutely guarantee the sovereignty of the non-Russian speaking Ukraine. Now, the part where a lot of people feel like Trump was wrong is he was saying, and the Russian parts, Donbass, East Ukraine, parts of Crimea can go back to Russia or stay Russia or whatever. The parts that, by the way, Putin already had conquered in war. And I mean, is that so crazy? Is that so outrageous? Let's talk about it. Let's make those demilitarized zones. Let's look at different ways. Let's explore. It's got to be better, right? Than just constantly lobbing shells and dropping bombs and killing, which is what we've seen over the past year. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands dead. So I don't know where the idea comes from that this is such a bad, crazy suggestion. Now you might say, well, you can't do that. You can't get people in a room. Let's talk about places, times in the past Well, here's one thing that did work in our lifetime, at least my lifetime. Some of you are probably too young. 1978, 79. What worked? What has brought about peace in the Middle East between three, really four of the most violent adversaries from 1948 until 1978? What was it? Who were the countries? Israel, Egypt, and then you add on Jordan and Syria. Those countries have been at peace for 45 years. Now, why have they been? What brought it about? They were in a room. Jimmy Carter got Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat in a room in Camp David, and they kept pushing and pushing. Both countries knew it wasn't in their interests, or certainly of their citizens' interests, to be the leaders of those countries certainly realized, gathered, it wasn't in the interest of their countries, of their citizens, to continue the war footing, the extraordinary military expenditures on military supplies and being on a war footing permanently. Now, I'm not saying it's great to be in Egypt right now. I'm not saying it's great to be in Syria, and Syria certainly has its problems, as does Jordan. But at least they're not at war with Israel. And the same goes with Israel. So it actually does work. I mean, we've seen it work. And this isn't the only place. This isn't the only time where peace is broken out because of the adversary leadership getting in a room and talking. Last I checked, we actually were able to negotiate peace with Russia, with the former Soviet Union, the same way. Reagan and now I can't, Gorbachev, were in the same room, and they talked it out, and they made peace with each other. So the idea that Trump came up with is hardly as absurd as your I'm talking about. Why are we there? Because it's in the interest. What is the function? What is the function? We talked about functionality before. What function is served by making Trump so evil in your mind, so bereft of any sense whatsoever, that anyone who even suggests he might be on the right track on anything is mocked and embarrassed and shamed? Why are we there? Because so we'll just give in. So we'll just say, okay, let's keep the military industrial complex large and in charge. Let's keep voting for bloated Pentagon budgets. Let's not even question the wisdom of a confrontation with Russia. That's why. That's the very simple. Let's not even entertain the notion that the neoliberal free trade dynamic paradigm is best for us. Because Trump talked about tariffs. So if Trump supports tariffs, then we've all got to just make fun of him, right? Now, look, I'm not voting for him. I'm making the point that because these ideas that he has presented are actually sensible, rather than laugh and mock them, we need to recognize that the Democratic Party itself, by its embrace of Trump derangement syndrome is utterly bankrupt morally and intellectually. Now, if they weren't, if there were some Democrats who said, no, Trump's got, look, we don't like him, but he makes some good points. I would say let's look at them, but none of them are saying that, and it's ironic too, because again, as bad as the Republican Party are, Matt Gaetz kind of sort of stood up for Ilhan Omar, saying, well, she made some good points about Somalia. She made some good points about, we shouldn't make fun of her on every score. That's like this crazy Matt Gaetz. But not one Democrat is prepared to say, we got to pull back our support for just keeping the flow, the gusher of military supplies that are feeding this war, this death and destruction. Could mean the end of the world. Certainly isn't helping. It's certainly exacerbating the climate crisis. There's oil and gas interests that are a big part of this, because they want a monopoly when it comes to distribution in the West. And we see that from the Nord Stream pipeline. So that's the function, is to keep the stranglehold of the neo-libs and the neocons over the West. To me, that's a pretty bad reason to embrace Trump derangement syndrome. All right, I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Please share, please like. You're not going to hear this anywhere else.